Rama Rama Hari 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 Krishna Krishna Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram Rama Rama Hari 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 Ram Hari Rama Rama Hari 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 Krishna Krishna Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram Rama Rama Hari 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 Krishna Krishna Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram Rama Rama Hari 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 Ram Hari Rama Rama Hari 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 Ram Hari 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 Krishna Rama 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 Hari 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 Rama 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 Hari 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 Krishna Krishna Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram Rama Hari Hari Krishna Priya Ram
Hare Кришна, Гуру Махарадж, примите наши поклоны со славой Шрила Прабхупады. Мы очень рады вас видеть, Гуру Махарадж. Спасибо за ваше общение.
Haribol, Haribol, Haribol. Очень рад видеть вас. Тринадцать кругов Ki Jai.
Гуру Махарадж Ки Джай.
Hare Krishna. Haribol. Хорошая девочка. Ram, Ram, Hari, 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 Krishna, Hari, Krishna. Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari. Ram, Ram, Hari, 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 Ram, Hari, Ram. Ram, Ram, Hari, 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 Krishna, Hari, Krishna. Ram, Ram, Hari, 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 Krishna. Ram, Ram, Hari, 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 Ram, Hari. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, 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 Hari. Krishna, Hari, Krishna. Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari, Hari. Hari, Ram, 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 Hari, Hari, Hari. Krishna, Hari, Krishna. Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Hari, Ram. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Krishna, Hari, Krishna. Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Hari, Ram. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Krishna, Hari, Krishna. Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Hari, Ram. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Krishna, Hari, Krishna. Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Hari, Ram. Ram, Ram, 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 Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, 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 Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Hari, Ram. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Hari, Ram. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Krishna, Hari, Krishna. Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Hari, Ram. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Krishna, Hari, Krishna. Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Hari, Ram. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Krishna, Hari, Krishna. Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Hari, Ram. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Hari, Ram. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Hari, Ram. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Krishna, Hari, Krishna. Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Hari, Ram. Ram, Ram, 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 Hari, Hari, Hari. Krishna, Hari, Krishna. Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Krishna, Hari, Krishna. Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Hari, Ram. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Krishna, Hari, Krishna. Okay. Okay, Krishna Priya и Rasa Priya, я должен читать лекцию сейчас. Знаете, слышали об этом? Простите меня, пожалуйста. Окей, увидимся позже. Окей. Харибол. Рам, Рам, Хари, Хари, Хари. Кришна, Кришна. Хари, 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 Рама. Rama, Rama, Hari, Hari. Hari Ram, Hari Ram, 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 Hari, 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 Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari, Hari Ram, Hari Ram, Ram, Ram. It's so funny. Prabhupada, the boy wants to know how to make chapatis. Prabhupada says, $100 please for the recipe. And the boy went home to get the money, but he couldn't get $100. But Prabhupada taught him anyway. Ram, Ram, Hari, 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 Krishna, Hari, Krishna. Okay, so here we go. All right. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Charni Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschachadish Tarne Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu-Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Vanchkalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhyevacha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Okay, so Srila Prabhupada, he's got his own place, although it's not a good place, but it's something. And he's meeting some people, and one or two becoming a little interested. Robert Nelson, a little interested, not really ready for getting into it deeply, but, definitely better than nothing. And so this is where we are. So the Paradox at 64 East 7th Street on the Lower East Side was a restaurant dedicated to the philosophy of George's Osawa and the macrobiotic diet. It was a storefront below street level with small dining tables placed around the candlelit room. The food was inexpensive and well reputed. Tea was served free, as much as you liked. More than just a restaurant, the Paradox was a center for spiritual and cultural interests, a meeting place reminiscent of the cafes of Greenwich Village or Paris in the 1920s. A person could spend the whole day at the Paradox without buying anything, and no one would complain. The crowd at the Paradox was a mystical congregation, interested in teachings from the East. When news of the new Swami uptown at Dr. Mishra's reached the Paradox, the word spread quickly. Wow. Harvey Cohen and Bill Epstein were friends. Harvey was a freelance artist, and Bill worked at the Paradox. After Harvey had been to Prabhupada's place at Dr. Mishra's yoga studio a few times, he came by the Paradox and began to describe all about the new Swami to Bill and other friends. Bill, I was working at the Paradox one night when Harvey came to me and said, I went to visit Mishra and there's a new Swami there and he's really fantastic. Well, I was involved in macrobiotics and Buddhism, so at first I couldn't care less. But Harvey was a winning and warm personality, and he seemed interested in this. He said, "Why don't you come uptown? I would like you to see this." Yeah, so Harvey, Bill's working there, and Harvey, so Bill's kind of, apathetic, but Harvey's into it, and he suggests, "Come with me, come uptown, and you must see this." But this is Bill speaking, who's otherwise not so much into it, not so interested, but anyways, working at the Paradox. So I went to one of the lectures on 72nd Street. That's Prabhupada's little place. Is it? Yeah, I think it's Prabhupada's little place. Yeah. I walked in there and I could feel a certain presence from the Swami. He had a certain very concentrated, intense appearance. He looked pale and kind of weak. I guess he had just come here and he had been through a lot of things. He was sitting there chanting on his beads, which he carried in a little bead bag. Oh, this is probably room 501, the other one. Am I guessing or what? Anyway. So, he was sitting there chanting on his beads, which he carried in a little bead bag. One of Dr. Mishra's students was talking, and he finally got around to introducing the Swami. He said, "We are the moons to the Swami's sun." He introduced him in that way. The Swami got up and talked. I didn't know what to think about it. At that time, the only steps I'd taken in regard to Indian teaching were through Ramakrishna. But this was the first time, to my knowledge, that bhakti religion had come to America. Well, I remember myself when I first heard Prabhupada, 1972, April at the university. Well, actually, I couldn't really follow his English well. Yeah. So, it didn't, on the conscious level, it didn't make so much of an impression. But on a deeper level, wow, it made a huge impression. Bill Epstein, that's who's been speaking now, quite in contrast to Robert Nelson, was a dashing, romantic person with long, wavy, dark hair and a beard. He was good-looking and effervescent and took upon himself a role of informing people at the restaurant of the city's spiritual news. Once he became interested in the Swami, in the new Swami, he made the Swami an ongoing topic of conversation at the restaurant. Bill, I went in the back and I asked Richard, the manager, "I'm going to take some food to the Swami. You don't mind, do you?" He said, "No, take anything you want." So I took some brown rice and other stuff, and I brought it up there. I went upstairs and I knocked on the door, and there was no answer. I knocked again, and I saw that the light was on because it had a glass panel, and finally he answered. I was really scared because I'd never really accepted any teacher. He said, come in, sit down." We started talking, and he said to me, "The first thing that people do when they meet is to show each other love. They exchange names. They exchange something to eat." So he gave me a slice of apple, and he showed me the tape recorder he had, probably for recording his chants. Then he said, "Have you ever chanted?" I said, "No, I haven't chanted before." So he played a chant, and then he spoke to me some more. He said, "You must come back." I said, "Well, if I come back, I'll bring you some more food." Unquote. James Green, a 30-year-old carpentry teacher at Cooper Union, was delving into Eastern philosophy. He lived on the same block as the Paradox and began hearing about the Swami from Harvey Cohen and Bill Epstein while regularly taking his evening meal at the restaurant. James, it was really Harvey and Bill who got things going. I remember one evening at Mishra's in which Swamiji was only a presence but did not speak. Mishra's students seemed more into the bodily aspect of yoga. This seemed to be one of Swamiji's complaints. His room on 72nd Street was quite small. He was living in a fairly narrow room with a door on the one end. So it is that, like a railway carriage, they say. And we were rather closely, Swamiji would set himself up along one side, and we were rather closely packed. It may have been no more than 8 feet wide. That's not even 3 meters, yeah. And it was rather dim. He sat on his thin mattress, and then we sat on the floor. We wouldn't chant. We would just come, and he would lecture. There was no direction other than the lecture on the Bhagavad Gita. I had read a lot of literature, and in my own shy way, I was looking for a master, I think. I have no aggression in me or go-getting quality. I was really just a listener, and this seemed right, hearing the Bhagavad Gita, so I kept coming. It just seemed as if things would grow from there. More and more people began coming. Then it got crowded, and he had to find another place. So you can see, it's developing. Yeah, Prabhupada. It's developing. The new group, so that's unquote. The new group from the Paradox was young and hip, in contrast to the older, more conservative uptown people who had been attending Prabhupada's classes. In those days, it was still unusual to see a person with long hair and a beard. And when such people started coming to the Swami's meetings on the west side, some of the older people were alarmed. As one of them noted, Swami Bhaktivedanta began to pick up another kind of people. He picked them up at the Bowery. The Bowery. You heard of the Bowery? It's like where all the hobos and street people and just addicts and alcoholics and, oh gosh, all those people hang out, sure. But it was more just the young people, I think. It wasn't really the Bowery people so much. And they came with funny hats and grey blankets wrapped around themselves, and they startled me. David Allen, a 21-year-old seeker who came up from the Paradox, had just moved to the city, optimistically attracted by what he had read about experimentation with drugs. He saw the old group as, quote, a kind of fuss-budgety group of older women on the west side, listening to the Swami's lectures. David, because this is 66, anyway, yeah. We weren't known as hippies then, but it was strange for the people who had originally been attracted to him. It was different for them to relate to this new group. I think most of the teachers from India up to that time had older followers, and sometimes wealthy widows would provide a source of income. But Swamiji changed right away to the younger, poorer group of people. The next thing that happened was that Bill Epstein and others began talking about how it would be better for the Swami to come downtown to the Lower East Side. Things were really happening down there, and somehow they weren't happening uptown. People downtown really needed him. Downtown was right, and it was ripe. There was life down there. There was a lot of energy going around. Chapter 17, on the Bowery. Whoa. So a little quote from Srila Prabhupada from a conversation. I couldn't understand the difference between friends and enemies. My friend was shocked to hear that I was moving to the Bowery. But although I passed through many dangers, I never thought that this is danger. Everywhere I thought, this is my home. April 1966. Someone broke into room 307 while Srila Prabhupada was out and stole his typewriter and tape recorder. Whoa. When Prabhupada returned to the building, the janitor informed him of the theft. An unknown burglar had broken the transom glass. Well, you know what that is. Just over the door, sometimes you get a separate thing. But like down in Chatsworth, we have them barred up or closed completely because... So an unknown burglar had broken the transom glass, climbed through, taken the valuables, and escaped. As Prabhupada listened, he became convinced that the janitor himself was the culprit. Of course, he couldn't prove it, so he accepted the loss with disappointment. Some friends offered replacements for his old typewriter and tape recorder. In a letter to India, he described the theft as a loss of more than 1,000 rupees, $157. It's 8. If 1,000 rupees is $157, there's 8 rupees to the dollar, approximately. So this is now from Prabhupada's letter. It is understood that such crime as has been committed in my room is very common in New York. This is the way of material nature. American people have everything in ample, and the worker gets about rupees 100 as daily wages, $12 a day. And still there are thieves for want of character. The social condition is not very good. Unquote. Prabhupada had told Joseph Forster, the Scindia ticket agent, that he would be returning to India in a couple of months. That was 7 months ago. Now, for the first time since his arrival, Prabhupada had returned to the Scindia ticket office in Brooklyn. He talked about the theft to Mr. Forster, who responded with, "Welcome to the club," and told Prabhupada about the recent theft of his own automobile. Such things, he explained, were not unusual for New York City. He told Prabhupada of the dangers of the city and how to avoid thefts and muggings. Prabhupada listened, shaking his head. He told Mr. Forster that American young people were misguided and confused. He discussed his plans for returning to India and showed Mr. Forster one of his Bhagavatams. Prabhupada had lost his spirit for living in room 307. What would prevent the janitor from stealing again? Harvey Cohen and Bill Epstein had advised him to relocate downtown and had assured him of a more interested following among the young people there. It had been an attractive proposal, and he began to reconsider it. Then Harvey offered Prabhupada his studio on the Bowery. Harvey had been working as a commercial artist for a Madison Avenue advertising firm when a recently acquired inheritance had spurred him to move into a loft on the Bowery to pursue his own career as a painter. But he was becoming disillusioned with New York. A group of acquaintances addicted to heroin had been coming around and taking advantage of his generosity, and his loft had recently been burglarized. He decided to leave the city and go to California, but before leaving, he offered his loft for Prabhupada to share with David Allen. David Allen had heard that Harvey Cohen was moving to San Francisco if he could sublet his AIR loft, Artist in Residence. In New York, it's like that. They have these big lofts, and artists use them. Harvey hadn't known David very long, but on the night before Harvey was supposed to leave, he coincidentally met David 3 different times in 3 different places on the Lower East Side. Harvey took this as a sign that he should rent the loft to David, but he specifically stipulated that the Swami should move in too. As Prabhupada was preparing to leave his 72nd Street address, an acquaintance, an electrician who worked in the building, came to warn him. The Bowery was no place for a gentleman, he protested. It was the most corrupt place in the world. Prabhupada's things had been stolen from room 307, but moving to the Bowery was not the answer. Srila Prabhupada's new home, the Bowery, had a long history. In the early 1600s, when Manhattan was known as New Amsterdam and was controlled by the Dutch West India Company, Peter Minuit, the governor of New Netherland, staked out a north-south road that was called the Bowery because a number of boweries or farms, I guess in Dutch, lay on either side. It was a dusty country road lined with quaint Dutch cottages, 97, and bordered by the peach orchards growing in the estate of Peter Stuyvesant. It became part of the high road to Boston and was of strategic importance during the American Revolution as the only land entrance to New York City. In the early 1800s, the Bowery was predominated by German immigrants. Later in the century, it became predominantly Jewish, and gradually it became the city's center of theatrical life. However, as a history of Lower Manhattan describes, after 1870 came the period of the Bowery's celebrated degeneration. Fake auction rooms, saloons specializing in 5-cent whiskey and knockout drops, sensational dime museums, filthy and rat-ridden stale beer dives, together with Charles M. Hoyt's song, the Bowery, I'll never go there anymore," fixed it forever in the nation's consciousness as a place of unspeakable corruption. Whoa. The reaction of Prabhupada's electrician friend was not unusual. The Bowery is still known all over the world as Skid Row, a place of ruined and homeless alcoholics. Perhaps the uptown electrician had done business in the Bowery and had seen the derelicts sitting around, passing a bottle, or lying unconscious in the gutter, or staggering up to passers-by and drunkenly bumping into them to ask for money. Most of the Bowery's 7,000 or 8,000 homeless men slept in lodging houses that required them to vacate their rooms during the day. Having nowhere else to go and nothing else to do, they would loiter on the street, standing silently on the sidewalks, leaning against a wall, or shuffling slowly along, alone or in groups. In cold weather, they would wear 2 coats and several suits of clothes at once, and would sometimes warm themselves around a fire they would keep going in a city garbage can. At night, those without lodging slept on the sidewalks, doorsteps, and street corners, crawled into discarded boxes, or sprawled side by side next to the bars. Thefts were commonplace. A man's pockets might be searched 10 or 20 times while he slept. The rates of hospitalization and death in the Bowery were 5 times higher than the national average, and many of the homeless men bore marks of recent injuries or violence. Prabhupada's loft, 94 Bowery, was 6 blocks south of Houston Street. At Houston and Bowery, derelicts converged in the heavy crosstown traffic. When cars stopped for the light, bums would come up and wash the windshields and ask for money. South of Houston, the first blocks held mostly restaurants, supply stores, lamp stores, taverns, and luncheonettes. The buildings were of 3 and 4 stories, old, narrow, crowded tenements, their faces covered with heavy fire escapes. Traffic on the Bowery ran uptown and downtown. You've been to New York, you've been on the Bowery. I've driven through it a number of times. Doesn't look that bad now. Okay. Cars parked on both sides of the street, and the constant traffic passed tightly. During the business day, working people passed briskly among the slow-moving derelicts. Many of the store windows were covered with protective iron gates, but behind the gates, the store owners lit their varieties of lamps to attract prospective wholesale and retail customers. 94 Bowery was just 2 doors north of Hester Street. No, we haven't heard of Hester Street yet. The corner was occupied by the spacious Half Moon Tavern, which was frequented mostly by neighborhood alcoholics. Above the tavern sat a 4-story Bowery flophouse. I guess it means where they just go and sleep at night. Marked by a neon sign, Palmer House, which was covered by a protective metal cage and hung from the 2nd floor on large chains. The hotel's entrance at 92 Bowery, which had no lobby, but only a desolate hallway covered with dirty white tiles, was no more than 6 feet from the entrance to 94. 94 Bowery was a narrow 4-story building. It had long ago been painted grey and bore the usual facing of a massive black fire escape. A well-worn black double door, its glass panels reinforced with chicken wire, opened onto the street. The sign above the door read, AIR, 3rd and 4th, indicating that artists in residence occupied those floors. The 1st floor of the next building north, 96 Bowery, was used for storage, and its front entrance was covered with a rusty iron gate. At 98 Bowery was another tavern, Harold's, smaller and dingier than the Half Moon. Thus the block consisted of 2 saloons, a flophouse, and 2 buildings with lofts. In the 1960s, loft living was just beginning in that area of New York City. The city had given permission for painters, musicians, sculptors, and other artists who required more space than available in most apartments to live in buildings that had been constructed as factories in the 19th century. After these abandoned factories had been fitted with fireproof doors, bathtubs, shower stalls, and heating, an artist could inexpensively use a large space. These were the AIR lofts. Harvey Cohen's loft on the top floor of 94 Bowery was an open space almost 100 feet long from east to west and 25 feet wide. It received a good amount of sunlight on the east, the Bowery side, and it also had windows at the west end, as well as a skylight. The exposed rafters of the ceiling were 12 feet above the floor. Harvey Cohen had used the loft as an art studio, and racks for paintings still lined the walls. A kitchen and shower were partitioned off in the northwest corner, and a room divider stood about 15 feet from the Bowery side windows. This divider did not run from wall to wall, but was open at both ends, and it was several feet short of the ceiling. It was behind this partition that Prabhupada had his personal living area. A bed and a few chairs stood near the window, and Prabhupada's typewriter sat on his metal trunk next to the small table that held his stacks of Bhagavatam manuscripts. His dhotis hung drying on a clothesline. On the other side of the partition was a dais, about 10 feet wide and 5 feet deep, on which Prabhupada sat during his kirtans and lectures. The dais faced west, toward the loft's large open space. Open, that is, except for a couple of rugs and an old-fashioned solid wood table, and on an easel, Harvey's painting of Lord Chaitanya dancing with his associates. The loft was a 4-flight walk up, and the only entrance, usually heavily bolted, was a door in the rear at the west end. From the outside, this door opened into a hallway, lit only by a red exit light over the door. The hallway led to the right a few steps and into the open area. If a guest entered during a kirtan or a lecture, he would see Swami about 30 feet from the entrance, seated on his dais. On other evenings, the whole loft would be dark, but for the glow of the red exit light in the little hallway and a soft illumination radiating from the other side of the partition where Prabhupada was working. Prabhupada lived on the Bowery, sitting under a small light, while hundreds of derelicts also sat under hundreds of naked lights on the same city block. He had no more fixed income than the derelicts, nor any greater security of a fixed residence. Yet his consciousness was different. He was translating Srimad Bhagavatam into English, speaking to the world through his Bhaktivedanta purports. His duty, whether on the 14th floor of a Riverside Drive apartment building or in a corner of a Bowery loft, was to establish Krishna consciousness as the prime necessity for all humanity. He went on with his translating and with his constant vision of a Krishna temple in New York City. Because his consciousness was absorbed in Krishna's universal mission, he did not depend on his surroundings for shelter. Home for him was not a matter of bricks and wood, but of taking shelter of Krishna in every circumstance. As Prabhupada had said to his friends uptown, "Everywhere is my home." Whereas without Krishna's shelter, the whole world would be a desolate place. Often he would refer to a scriptural statement that people live in 3 different modes: goodness, passion, and ignorance. Life in the forest is in the mode of goodness. Life in the city is in passion. And life in a degraded place like a liquor shop, a brothel, or the Bowery is in the mode of ignorance. But to live in a temple of Vishnu is to live in the spiritual world, Vaikuntha, which is transcendental to all 3 material modes. And this Bowery loft where Prabhupada was holding his meetings and performing kirtan was also transcendental. When he was behind the partition, working in his corner before the open pages of Srimad Bhagavatam, that room was as good as his room back at the Radha Damodar temple in Vrindavan. News of the Swami's move to the Bowery loft spread, mostly by word of mouth at the Paradox restaurant, and people began to come by in the evening to chant with him. The musical kirtans were especially popular on the Bowery, since the Swami's new congregation consisted mostly of local musicians and artists who responded more to the transcendental music than to the philosophy. Every morning he would hold a class on Srimad Bhagavatam, attended by David Allen, Robert Nelson, and another boy, and occasionally he would teach cooking to whoever was interested. He was usually available for personal talks with any inquiring visitors or with his new roommate. Although Prabhupada and David each had a designated living area in the large loft, the entire place soon became dominated by Prabhupada's preaching activities. Prabhupada and David got on well together, and at first, Prabhupada considered David an aspiring disciple. April 27th. He wrote to his friends in India describing his relationship with David Allen. Quote, he was attending my class at 72nd Street along with others, and when I experienced this theft case in my room, he invited me to his residence. So I'm with him and training him. He has good prospect because already he has given up all bad habits. In this country, illicit connection with women, smoking, drinking, and eating of meats are common affairs. Besides that, there are other bad habits, like using only toilet paper and not bathing after evacuating, etc. But by my request, he's given up 90% of his old habits, and he is chanting Mahamantra regularly. So I'm giving him the chance, and I think he's improving. Tomorrow I've arranged for some prasadam distribution, and he's gone to purchase some things from the market, unquote. When David first came to the Bowery, he appeared like a clean-cut college student. He was 21, 6 feet tall, blue-eyed, handsome, and intelligent-looking. Most of his new friends in New York were older and considered him a kid. David's family lived in East Lansing, Michigan, and his mother was paying $100 monthly to sublease the loft. Although he did not have much experience, he had read that a new realm of mind expansion was available through psychedelic drugs, and he was heading fast into the hazardous world of LSD. His meeting with the Swami came at a time of radical change and profoundly affected his life. David. It was a really good relationship I had with the Swami, but I was overwhelmed by the tremendous energy of being that close to him. It spurred my consciousness very fast. Even my dreams at night would be so vivid of Krishna consciousness. I was often sleeping when the Swami was up, because he was up late in the night working on his translations. That's possibly where a lot of the consciousness and dreams just flowed in, because of that deep relationship. It also had to do with studying Sanskrit. There was a lot of immediate impact with the language. The language seemed to have such a strong mystical quality, the way he translated it word for word. Prabhupada's old friend from uptown, Robert Nelson, continued to visit him on the Bowery. He was impressed by Prabhupada's friendly relationship with David, who he saw was learning many things from the Swami. Mr. Robert bought a small American-made hand organ, similar to an Indian harmonium, and donated it to David for chanting with Prabhupada. At 7 in the morning, Mr. Robert would come by, and after Bhagavatam class, he would talk informally with Prabhupada, telling his ideas for making records and selling books. He wanted to continue helping the Swami. They would sit in chairs near the front window, and Mr. Robert would listen while Prabhupada talked for hours about Krishna and Lord Chaitanya. 97. New people began coming to see Prabhupada on the Bowery. Carl Jurgens, a 30-year-old black man from the Bronx, had attended Cornell University and was now independently studying Indian religion and Zen Buddhism. He had experimented with drugs as psychedelic tools, and he had an interest in the music and poetry of India. He was influential among his friends and tried to interest them in meditation. He had even been dabbling in Sanskrit. Carl. I had just finished reading a book called The Wonder That Was India. Have you heard of that? It's a very famous book. Yeah, I've seen that book. Yeah, it's a famous book. I had gotten the definition of a sannyasi and a brahmachari and so forth. There was a vivid description in that particular book of how you could see a sannyasi coming down the road with his saffron robe. It must have made more than just a superficial impression on me, because it came to me this one chilly evening. I was going to visit Michael Grant, Mukunda. Michael Grant, yeah. I was going to visit Michael Grant, probably going to smoke some marijuana and sit around, maybe play some music, and I was coming from Hester Street. If you make a left on Bowery, you can go up to Mike's place on Grand Street. But it's funny that I chose to go that way, because the shorter way would have been to go down Grand Street. But if I'd gone that way, I would probably have missed Swamiji. So I decided to go down Hester and then make a left. All of a sudden, I saw in this dingy alcove a brilliant saffron robe. As I passed, I saw it was Swamiji knocking on the door, trying to gain entrance. There were two bums hunched up against the door. It was like a two-part door. One of them was sealed and the other was locked. The two bums were lying on either side of Swamiji. One of these men had actually expired, died, which often happened, and you had to call the police or health department to get them. I don't think I saw the men lying in the doorway until I walked up to Swamiji and asked him, "Are you a sannyasi?" And he answered, "Yes." We started this conversation about how he was starting a temple, and he mentioned Lord Chaitanya and the whole thing. He just came out with this flow of strange things to me right there in the street. But I knew what he was talking about somehow. I had the familiarity of having just read this book and delved into Indian religion. So I knew that this was a momentous occasion for me. And I wanted to help him. We banged on the door, and eventually we got into the loft. He invited me to come to a kirtan, and I came back later that night for my first kirtan. From that point on, it was a fairly regular thing, 3 times a week. At one point, Swamiji asked me to stay with him, and I stayed for about 2 weeks. You know, I think we'll end there, although it's not the end of a section. You get these sections with these 3 stars, but it'll take us quite some time, really quite some time to get there. So just remember, Carl says, I stayed for about 2 weeks. Okay, that's where we're leaving off. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.